Good morning to all of you guys. So as I mentioned, my background's in political theory and philosophy, and we are not as adept at the slide making as some of you guys. So apologies, you don't have anything quite so lovely from me, but I think it's okay in this case, because what I'd like to talk about, or really what I'd like to do, is just sort of pose some ethical questions. I don't have any definitive answers, although we could try and work through some definitive answers in the breakout groups. But really, I just want to get us started thinking about the philosophical dimensions of artificial intelligence and machine learning as we move on through the rest of the day and through the rest of the year's programs. So just to begin, we all have a sense of the immense positive potential that AI has introduced to the modern world, freeing people from tedious and often dangerous labor, and pushing scientific advancements ahead at rates never before possible in the history of humanity. And many of us have also heard the doomsday scenarios that Ed pointed out earlier that warn of real-life HALs, supercomputers that can grow to outsmart and control humans to disastrous ends for our species. While this may still seem like the stuff of dystopian science fiction, this apocalyptic view has been endorsed by some of the leading developers in the field of AI research and is currently framing popular discourse and movies about the future of AI. Now, my goal here isn't to take a position on these two competing narratives or whether negative potentialities of AI outweigh its positive benefits. Although if I were to take a position, I suppose I'd say that I agree with Ed that these fears are probably likely overblown. At least I think that they should be. That's because there's still a lot of room for us to influence the path of AI development and determine what these new technologies will mean for our collective future. In order to do so, however, we need to be thinking about AI not just in terms of how it could improve or harm society going forward, but also in terms of how it exists in the here and the now. In other words, we need to be asking ourselves the question, what do our technological choices say about us as a people, and what do we want them to say? AI is already being applied in a wide range of disciplines, from medical diagnosis to criminal sentencing to content moderation, but is only just beginning to realize its potential to influence practically all areas of human existence. As these technologies continue to advance and increasingly come to mediate the lives of everyday individuals across the globe, it becomes necessary to consider how they may reflect prevailing philosophical norms and preferences. Equally important, we need to think about how the choices we make now regarding the areas we choose to pursue and the architectural design of individual AI technologies can impact human values in the future. As Ed mentioned, CITP has recently teamed up with the University Center for Human Values to start exploring the philosophical dimensions of AI and machine learning with an eye towards producing a positive impact on the development of this emerging field. What we're trying to do is build a partnership between industry and academia that acknowledges the complex relationship between individual-level AI engineering decisions and the scope of the overarching human values. In the spirit of this endeavor, we'll be pooling resources from philosophy, engineering, and social science in order to develop a set of intellectual and reasoning tools that can be used to guide practitioners and policymakers in developing the ethical frameworks that will ultimately underpin their technical and legislative decisions. In a workshop on October 6th, CITP and UCHV brought 5 leading organizations in the field of AI to Princeton in order to discuss case studies in light of the ethical dimensions that they raise. Despite the fact that the technologies under consideration were all very different and each case focused on a unique industry, from social networking to education to law enforcement, several common themes emerged. I'm going to just discuss a few of the most salient issues here, but I expect that plenty more will come up over the course of our discussions later and in the afternoon's presentations. So just to begin, one of the themes that featured most prominently in this workshop was the question of to what extent user preferences ought to dictate the development of AI technologies. We heard repeatedly from companies that users are saying they want them to act, that they're asking for new, smarter technologies to be developed and made accessible, as Nick was saying earlier about these free speech and censorship technologies. Sometimes this ask comes in the form of explicit requests for consulting services and the development of new technologies. Sometimes companies infer consumer demands from survey data and panel studies, But either way, they determine what users seem to want and then try to deliver. Different corporate and industry cultures determine the different ways that they're going to respond. Some are more willing to say no, and some feel like they have to respond with yes all the time. But either way, they both reflect the idea that industry should be responsive to consumer demands. Now, at first, this might just seem like a truism, but there's a value judgment implicit in this consumer-driven construction, one that should at least be considered in the open. What does it mean to say that AI development should be responsive to the popular will? Is it really enough to say that if people claim to want something, companies should provide it? Is that sufficient justification for introducing new technologies to the world that may promote certain social goods but infringe upon others? Are there additional questions we should be asking? In responding to this suite of questions, or at least trying to, the first thing we need to do is consider whether consumers really know what they're asking for when they demand innovation in AI. In other words, is consumer demand well informed, and are we as a people being made aware of the potential consequences of individual technological choices? After all, a technology developed for one purpose may be easily co-opted or extended to other purposes. These extensions might bring us far afield from the original requests. Often it's not clear in advance how a new technology could later be used by various actors who will have access to it. AI purveyors note this as a concern, sometimes expressing surprise at the way that rogue developers and individual users end up using their products in the wild. But when this happens, who should be responsible for negative outcomes? Those who extended or modified these technologies? The original developers? The customers who created the demand in the first place? A market economy of AI, or a market economy model of AI, does little to answer these questions of responsibility and accountability on its own. Second, if the development of AI is conceived as being responsive to consumer preferences, we need to be aware that consumers may have conflicting wants. In fact, for the most part, they do. They may, for example, want search engines to do a better job of filtering out fake news or denying potential terrorists access to information they might use to harm others. When companies fail to perform these functions, they may sometimes face public backlash and calls to action, to be more proactive. But the same consumers who might chastise AI purveyors for not doing enough may simultaneously express concerns about the loss of privacy and the threats to liberty of conscience and liberty of speech. In other words, they may approve of the ends but not the means, or they may actually be hoping for contradictory ends, freedom to explore new ideas, for example, but also security against ideologies that might produce harm. And so when consumers are asked whether they want a particular AI product, it needs to be in the context of a more comprehensive series of questions. Where user preferences reflect internal inconsistencies, there must be a way to determine which goals are most important. Can we strike a balance? Who makes the final call and according to what criteria? But even if users are well informed of what they're demanding and companies are able to provide these services without infringing upon other values, which may in many cases be impossible, we still need to grapple with the idea of consumer sovereignty as the most important interest pushing intellectual and technological development. This is often taken as a given within capitalist systems, but maybe it shouldn't be. In determining the future of AI, we need to ask ourselves, does AI exist to satisfy the individual wants of those who might be affected by it, either by having something to gain or something to lose? Or is there some greater social will that we also need to be considering? In his most recent book, #Republic, Cass Sunstein argues that information technologies do not exist merely to satisfy consumer preferences. Instead, they are protected and even nurtured because they help to ensure and reproduce a healthy system of democratic self-governance. Information technologies help us to function better as citizens, he argues, by freeing up our time and creating opportunities for us to deliberate about our political worlds. These are good things. They can make us healthier, smarter, more capable, and better informed citizens and people too. That's part of why we value these technologies. But what happens when consumers demand products that interfere with these ends? What happens, for example, when users exhibit a preference to engage primarily with those who share their pre-existing opinions? In the case of AI, Is it the responsibility of corporate actors to accommodate those preferences and enhance our ability to sort into homogeneous mini-publics? Simply because that's more fun for us, that's what we're going to do, and if they don't do it, we'll go somewhere that does do that for us? Or do these companies have a larger democratic duty to expose us to ideas and people that we might not want to engage with, but the experience of which will make us better citizens, more tolerant, understanding, empathetic people? Even removing the responsibility that private corporate actors have to their shareholders and employees, these questions reflect two sets of important conflicting values, those of the individual and those of society as a whole. This conflict between AI as an industry that ought to be responsive to individual consumer demands and one that serves a greater democratic purpose should be at the center of philosophical debates on AI. And there aren't any easy answers here. In part, that reflects the ambivalence of the Western liberal values inherent in these systems that place the individual at the center of discussion, but are also situated within participatory democratic systems. Tech companies, even outside the United States, have been deeply influenced by the industry's libertarian roots. This is generally meant promoting the primacy of the individual, a respect for negative liberties, and a toleration of diversity. But while the introduction of AI has helped to enhance liberal values in many ways, it can also butt against them. Specifically, justifications that these companies are merely giving the people what they want are often undermined by paternalistic practices in real life. Now, the term paternalism might feel a little loaded, but I don't mean to say that it's always or necessarily bad. There are real reasons to think that elites within the world of AI might know better than the people what they really want. Information technologies can be intimidating and inaccessible to those who are inexperienced with them. It can be difficult and time-consuming for educators and corporations to inform the public about what is desirable and possible to achieve through AI. And in the time it takes to do so, others might be moving ahead less thoughtfully. To the extent that these technologies carry the potential to increase efficiency, improve safety, and enhance the lived human experience across any number of other dimensions, those in industry might feel that they have a moral obligation to introduce these products, regardless of what the public says that it wants. Act now, and the public will thank us for it. Fail to act, and they'll blame us for standing by. One of the most troubling issues facing AI is not that they're asking these questions and sometimes willing to move ahead with them, but that they fail to do so in a systematic, philosophically coherent way. In practice, much of the time, it ends up being individual engineers or engineering groups that make the final decisions about which technologies to pursue and how, often weighing the trade-offs in real time. In such an ad hoc system, it's hard to blame them for choosing any one particular set of values. So I'd say that their moral culpability is diminished by the fact that they're not even always aware that they're making value judgments. The decisions about who to design for, whose knowledge to draw from, and who will oversee these systems, these all reflect individual assumptions and biases that get built into our technological infrastructure. Each choice might be minor, but as a whole, these decisions can have disastrous, or at least immense, outcomes. Another problem is that these value judgments are often being made behind the public gaze, and by individuals who do not see themselves as being responsible to a public from which they derive their authority to act. While government intervention isn't always, or even necessarily most of the time, going to be the answer when it comes to ethically sound decision-making in AI, we should be worried about ceding the ability to corporate entities that lack transparency and democratic accountability. Currently, AI companies are given a great deal of latitude. Industry giants like Facebook and Google are now larger and wealthier than many nation states, and they have a remarkable amount of influence in regulatory processes. In many ways, this makes sense. Governments adapt slowly to new technologies, whereas corporate bodies are more nimble and can move quickly. Because they're there, actually on the ground, they also know what's feasible and can respond effectively to empirical realities. But affording private corporate actors this kind of freedom to choose and pursue their own ends, even if we can trust that they're doing the right thing, which not everybody does, this introduces concerns about transparency. People expect to have a say in the world that they inhabit. This is part of our participatory culture, and one that information technologies helped to build over the past 30 or 40 years. Unfortunately, we as citizens can't always see what's going on behind the curtain. Can't always see what's going on behind the curtain in AI development, and this makes people nervous. As long as purveyors of AI continue to treat their technologies as these opaque black boxes, users will have cause to worry. They won't know what it is they're getting, or why, or what the alternatives might have been. They won't understand how choices were made, and developers and producers will not feel that they have a duty to present reasons accessible to all in order to justify their decision-making. That is going to stymie the thinking of the developers in the first place. But it's also going to lead to many on the receiving end of these technologies feeling inefficacious and fearing the future. They rightly sense that they have very little power to directly influence choices that affect their lives. As tech companies become larger and more pervasive, individuals are increasingly unable to opt out and therefore lose their primary means of holding corporate actors accountable. Some might say that this has already happened and that the power differential that now exists between those who are creating and selling AI and those who are being exposed to it has already reached the level of domination. I wouldn't personally go that far just yet, but the loss of democratic accountability is part of the trade-off of letting these actors govern themselves. It's also important to remember that the relative autonomy granted to AI developers also introduces new kinds of risk into the world. In creating these technologies, companies tend to decide for themselves how much risk to take on. But it's not always clear that they understand those risks fully or are willing or able to take on the responsibility for addressing them. Again, this is the result of them not having to justify their thought processes about how they make technical decisions. But there are major risks that need to be addressed, and not just in terms of threat to profits. The development process involves a great deal of research and experimentation on human subjects, often on people that don't really understand that they're being researched and experimented on. Even if the ends truly are worthwhile, we need to be wary of causing more harm than good to the individual when we administer experiments on them. This means answering hard questions about what harms we might be causing and why. So when Netflix, for example, includes a random movie in the list of items that are chosen just for me, that doesn't necessarily cost me all that much. I'm sort of fine with that experiment. When a judge decides whether to send me to jail based on an algorithm that even she doesn't understand what goes into, that might cost me quite a bit. And in terms of things like medical diagnosis, treatment, even organ transplants, the design of AI can be a matter of life or death. We might reasonably think that we have a right to know how decisions are made and according to which views of the world, whether it's a utilitarian perspective, for example, or one that values human life and human dignity. We might also think that we have a right to appeal when AI causes us harm according to an ideology to which we do not or would not consent, or when we feel like we're being treated unequally. So the question of equality comes up again and again in AI ethics. This is true in terms of the more micro questions, but also on a macro level, how AI influences our major social institutions. As a new sphere of technology, the development of AI is forcing us to rethink the changing nature of work, for example, and what it means to be self-sufficient. The ideal of the Protestant work ethic that has served as a pillar of the US Constitution and cultural development is now being called into question by these new technologies. But it's not across the board, at least not yet. As Ed mentioned earlier, different sectors of the economy are going to be hit by the effects of AI unequally or at different times. On a political level, we've seen how this can manifest in increased feelings of alienation and being left behind that push displaced workers into ever more extreme political positions. But even before it reaches that point, many people will have their lives upended, with those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder being affected first and least capable of protecting themselves. None of this is a secret, but what do we do about it? Some industry leaders have recently made public calls for a universal basic income to help those who are bound to lose out in this new economy, and there are already some experiments going on in the US and elsewhere to see how those will play out. These giant private corporate actors can afford to run these kinds of small-scale experiments on their own. But are they willing to step up and provide general income relief for those who lose their jobs as the result of changing technological landscape? More importantly for me, should they be responsible for doing that? Is it the responsibility of a private company to protect the people, or does that fall on more representative institutions? Should AI remain a decentralized, relatively unregulated field, or is it more like a public utility with widespread social effects? In that case, we might need centralized policies, either through industry cooperation or government entities, that can steer growth and incentives in the right direction. What even is the right direction? Who decides? Once we have decided, how can it best be achieved? We've seen similar questions play out in other areas of scientific and technological advancement. In the case of climate science, for example, philosophers and practitioners have long had to grapple with the conflict between causing meaningful harm to some and protecting communal resources for all in the long term. But it would be naive to think that such conflict can be resolved without clear winners and losers. Who loses, how badly, and what we owe to them should be at the forefronts of our minds, however. Now, again, as I said at the beginning, I gave you a lot of questions. I don't have the answers to all of them just yet. Most of them, really. What should be driving AI development? Which actors should be making the final choices about which ends to pursue and balancing competing value considerations? In the end, who should be responsible for the outcomes? Is transparency and accountability something that can or should be transferred to the private sphere? Are they concepts that we could just get rid of now? It's hard to say at this point, and there are plenty more questions besides that I haven't even addressed here. But the goal, I think, should be to start thinking through them together as part of a collaborative enterprise. The very first step in dealing with the ethical dimensions of artificial intelligence is opening a frank discussion where computer scientists, engineers, members of industry can speak from their own experiences. Rather than merely apply a pre-existing philosophical framework to the field of AI, we should begin by taking a sharp, clear-headed look at these technologies. And we shouldn't be afraid to be wrong. We should be open to experimentation. From there, we can build. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with this new initiative between UCHB and CITP. We're developing a set of case studies out of the discussions from our workshop in early October that will be used for educational purposes. By looking at individual instances of AI and guiding students through the process of assessing their ethical dimensions, we not only keep them engaged in philosophy, but offer real advice for how to translate philosophy into practice. We're also starting work on a foundational paper in AI ethics that makes explicit the necessity of an ethical framework and understanding of political philosophy for policymaking in this field. And then on March 9th, we'll be hosting a larger workshop to help expand this community and keep the conversation going. So hopefully you guys will all stay tuned.